Coming up on Effing Up the Ineffable.
It's scary.
Yeah, kind of a side comment on that, is one of those things that's kind of mind-blowing to know, is that genetically, there are more things that live inside you by sheer number that do not share your DNA than there are that do. There are more cells in your body that do not have your DNA than there are cells in your body that do have your DNA.
That's crazy.
But anyway.
Hello, everyone.
I'm Brian.
And I'm Mike.
We're experts in some things, such as IT, which we'll probably never discuss.
We're published authors with over 20 books.
Wait, we are? Which ones did I write?
We're musicians who played on albums and TV.
And developers who have written software used by literally millions of people.
Wait, really? I have?
Over the years, we have had in-depth conversations about everything from theoretical physics
To the nature of consciousness.
to why Marvel is way better than DC.
Is it, though?
And we thought maybe you'd like to listen in. Trust us, we're really interesting people. And smart.
And don't forget good looking.
And we're effing up the ineffable.
All right, so the topic this week is the sixth extinction, or sometimes called the Anthropocene extinction or the Holocene extinction. And I think before we get into this, we should probably give a little bit of a definition of what a mass extinction is, and then a little bit about what this one is in particular. I don't know if you want to broach what a mass extinction is, or you want me to go into that, or
Yeah, so I mean, I think most people know what extinction means, right? A particular species no longer exists. Or in some cases, we can call something that's extinct, and yet we still are, and under very, very limited circumstances, we may have, within containment, a small number, where we're trying to reintroduce them to the world at some point. But for the most part, if we're talking about extinction, we're talking about a species that has, every member of that species has died on the earth.
Yep.
And when we start talking about mass extinctions, rather than talking about just the dodo bird or something like that, what we're talking about is, a significant percentage of those species or genuses even that exist on the earth, that there's an extreme decrease in the biodiversity of those, that we're losing lots of them, significant percentages. There's been a lot of, or maybe I shouldn't say a lot, there's been many extinction events over the years. I say over the years, so it sounds like I'm talking about since high school. No, since the Earth has been in existence. Some have been what we've considered mass extinction events. Mm-hmm. That there's 5 that are generally talked about as being, the big 5, and we can go into that a little bit more. But when we talk about the 6th mass extinction, like you're talking about, we're talking about a significant percentage of the species of fauna and flora that exist on Earth today being gone at some point in the future.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's most interesting about this one is that it is at least partially and perhaps almost entirely caused by human beings, which is why it's a lot of times called the Anthropocene or the Holocene extinction, right. Because we're the ones actually causing the darn thing to happen, unlike the ones in the past where it's been caused by an asteroid strike or a volcanic eruption or just, a tilting of the Earth's axis, which caused, a global ice age or whatever, something that nothing could have accounted for. No, this is us dumb humans doing it all on our own, basically.
I read an article that said that humans were unique in their desire and ability to change the environment that they live in. That's part of what defines a human as a human, is that they have this innate desire to change the environment they live in. And we're I thought that was interesting because, in some respects, when we talk about this 6th extinction event, we're talking about something that's human-made, but in terms of all of the species of life that are on the Earth today or have ever existed as far as we know, we're the only ones that really could cause this.
Yeah, but I think this is kind of off topic, but I think that's more of a function of our intelligence than anything else. Not that I would really argue with that person who said that, our desire to change the environment is what makes us human. Because if you look at everything living, they all change their environment. Their tools are just much smaller. Like take ants. Like ant colonies will build these huge, elaborate, cave networks, right, underneath the ground for their colony. But that's really all they know how to do. They're just not smart enough to do. If they could figure out how to have air conditioning and microwave dinners, they would do it too. They just can't do that, right?
Right, but if you look at humankind, I mean, you mentioned air conditioning, and that's a great example, right? So you've got many species that can only live in certain biomes, and only, there are certain species that are only going to thrive in the rainforest or even in the desert. But humans can thrive almost anywhere because of our brains, like you said, because of our adaptability, because of our ability to change the environment in which we live in order to do that.
In order to suit us.
Exactly, to make ourselves more comfortable. So, and this is kind of a byproduct of that, right?
Right. And so I think this is a good place to kind of segue into why this is important for us specifically. And, I think for me, it really comes down to, global warming. I mean, I'll be honest, I was a skeptic of global warming for a long time. But I think certainly in the last 10 years and the last 5 years, it's become even more obvious that not only is it happening, it's happening at a tremendous pace. I mean, at a pace, it's still not quite. What was that movie that was so funny? It happened over like a year or something, and all of a sudden you had floods and everything in New York. But it's not happening quite at that pace. But it's just in our lifetime. I remember when I was a kid, it seemed like we had a good snow here in North Carolina pretty much every year. And now I can't remember the last time we had a good snow in North Carolina.
We are in the longest snow drought that we've had in recorded history. There's not been, in Charlotte anyway, there's not been any recorded snow in the last 2 winters.
Right.
And we've never had back-to-back winters where there's been no recorded snow since like the 1880s or something like that when they started recording it.
Right.
Now, it's easy to say, that in grand terms of things, that's a small sample size. You're talking about roughly 140 data points. And, you're bound to have back-to-back because we've had snowless winters before. So, if you're just using that, I mean,
I'm not saying that's the whole thing.
No, absolutely not. But I do see where that's interesting. I mean, it does, like, there's this thing in your mind where you say, yeah, it seems like it's hotter a lot more often than it used to be, and that the winters are milder and things like that. And then when you go looking at the data, like actually, and rather than it being just an anecdotal kind of thing that you hear people will argue back and forth all day long with anecdotes, and it's exhausting. You can look at the real data. You can go out to, government agencies from any, not just the U.S., but you can go and look at things from the EU and Japan and other places and look at, global climate data, and you can see, that's, if you look at our global temperatures right now, and as compared to, I think the baseline they usually use is the average between 1950 and 1980. Like right now, we are roughly 1 centigrade above the average. In 2022, I think was the baseline that I looked at. That's significant. I mean, what
it's like I don't know.
1.8 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, it's like in real units, it's like 1.8 Fahrenheit.
Real units.
Yeah.
What are you, American?
Yeah.
No, but I mean, in that, like, that doesn't seem like much. Like, you can look at that and say, what's the difference between 72 and 74? Like, that doesn't mean much.
But that's average. That's not.
Well, that's exactly right, and that's spread out over every day of the year, over every place on Earth. Now, some places are cooler, some places are warmer, some months are cooler or warmer, etc. But when you have that average and that affects every living thing on the planet, then you start having real impacts.
Well, yeah, and I think the other thing people don't realize is that that's additional energy going into the system. Like the one of the other things that became really obvious to me is that storms are much worse and they happen much more often. Like I remember, when Hugo came through, it was just unheard of that a hurricane would impact this far inland. It was like, it was end of the world kind of stuff. It was, we didn't have power for like 2 weeks. It was crazy.
I was going to say, I went through it in a double wide trailer on top of a hill. It was a Category 1 hurricane by the time it got to our area. And I would have slept through it, except my mom woke me up in the middle of the night to say, "Did you know there's a hurricane going on?"
Right.
but it was serious.
Right.
We didn't have much damage, but to your point, I think we were out of power as well for almost 2 weeks.
Yeah.
There were trees down everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, that was 1989.
Right. And since then, like there've been a couple of more hurricanes that have occurred, this far inland. And it's like, and back then, like when I was growing up, the idea of there being a tornado in this part of North Carolina was like, that was crazy talk. Like that was never going to happen. And I remember back when I used to commute to and from Charlotte, this was probably back in 2000-ish, somewhere around that range. I remember driving home and seeing two clouds circling each other and going, that's really weird. That's like a UFO or something, And I get home and, my wife tells me, who's an avid tornado buff, she tells me, oh no, that was a tornado. Like, there was a tornado warning or whichever
right.
one it is where somebody's seen the damn thing.
Yeah,
there was a tornado warning, in Locust, and that must have been what you saw, and now it's not uncommon. Like you actually see tornado warnings around here quite often,
It's kind of funny you say that. I was actually also driving home from Charlotte to Albemarle. I guess it was around 1999. And I thought I saw what looked like a funnel cloud off to my left as I was driving down the highway. And I was like, and I was only maybe 3 minutes from home at that point. So on one hand, I was like, I got to get home. On the other hand, it's like, I hope it doesn't damage my home. It was,
right.
Really thinking about that. And, I got home and turned on the weather and immediately went to like an interior room because I was a little bit, I was a little, maybe not panicked, but I was concerned.
Right.
And listening to it, like, this was 99 and they weren't as good even then as they are now as at, understanding tornadoes and the rotations and, what kind of radar and other tools that they have in order to look at the wind speeds and directions. And they were saying that there had been reports of a funnel cloud, but according to all their tools, that it was probably not actually a tornado. The next day, we found out that there was a church in the neighborhood of where I had seen it that had lost its roof, and it actually went through Albemarle and had taken out the awning over a gas station and a couple other places. Like there was no major damage from what I could tell, but it was like I felt vindicated,
Right.
But yeah, so but that was an extreme event. Now it feels like you've got tornado warnings like in the summer, like every other week.
Yeah, and putting my money where my mouth is, I had a rental property in Florida that I sold in large part because I have no faith anymore that it's going to be worth anything in 5 or 10 years. Like the last couple of hurricanes that have gone through there have just like kind of, they weren't that bad, but they're coming so often. It's just a matter of time, man. It's just, and it's not going to take that long, So
well, and the thing with hurricanes too is that everybody wants to focus on the category, which has to do with wind speed. And obviously, the higher winds are more dangerous, and I don't want to minimize that. But often, it's the sheer size of the storms. It can be a lower category storm, but the sheer size of it and the amount of rainfall that comes with it can in many cases be much more damaging.
Yeah, it causes so much flooding it can destroy entire regions. Yeah. That was that one in Texas that did it, a couple of years ago that,
Oh, right, where it just kind of sat over Houston for
and just
2
dropped
days.
rain. Yeah.
Yeah, that was awful.
Yeah. So things like that are just getting worse, and it just it really kind of piqued my interest. So I started reading some books on it. I read The Sixth Extinction, which is good, but it's kind of
just an introduction to it.
Right. It's kind of talking about, some of it's very individualized. It's talking about very specific cases of specific species that are going extinct and kind of why they went extinct. And that's very good.
Well, and we'll probably come back to that, but I do want to say, even though it is, just like we talked about having anecdotes. Sometimes they're good if you're using them as an introduction to a larger topic.
Right.
And in many cases in that book, that's what they were doing. One of the things they talked about was, I think it was like a golden tree frog or something like that.
The Brazilian golden tree frog.
Yeah. That, the reason that it had gone extinct had to do with this particular fungus that existed. But, it's easy to say, okay, this is nature and, extinctions happen. I guess that's probably one of the things we need to talk about. There is a background level of extinction.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. We have things, there are species that are going to go extinct, and it has nothing to do with humans. It's just the fact of the environment changes, the number of predators change, the whole the whole biosphere can change based on just the number of the each level of the food pyramid, if you will, and how that happens, the environment, all of that. So, it's easy to say, okay, this is something that was new, that was introduced to this area, and it just so happened that these tree frogs were susceptible to it. And while that's true, then you come to find out as you read more into that it's the fungus that killed them off, that it didn't naturally occur in that environment. That the reason it was there, the reason that a lot of things have happened has to do with, human-induced invasive species.
Yep.
You've got something that normally lives, let's just say, in Europe, that, it's already killed off everything that's susceptible to it in Europe, but then, you happen to pick up an orange on your flight from Europe to South America, and then you throw it in a trash can and it happens to have this mold on it, and before you know it, you've wiped out a species because of this.
Yep.
And it has to do with the fact that you're helping to spread these invasive species. So it becomes one of the ways that humans can induce some of these extinction events.
Right, and so it's like it's the smallpox blanket story all over again. How European settlers brought over smallpox, and that killed a lot of the indigenous natives and helped them really conquer them. It's the same kind of thing. It's not that the species that was introduced was any better adapted to the area. It's that there was no symbiosis between that species and the species that were already in the area. The species that were already in the area had no protection against this species, and so it could just take over. So I think this is a good place to go into like some of the contributing factors. I kind of wrote down a short list of what I thought the major ones were without. I'm going to say these are, I consider like the primary factors. I think there are secondary factors that come out of a lot of these, but as the primary things, one of them was greenhouse gas emissions, which is really just a way of saying CO2, methane, those kinds of concentrations in the atmosphere, which may or may not come from humans, but since the Industrial Revolution, the uptick is so large, it's really hard to say it's coming from anything other than humans.
And even in some cases, it's indirectly from humans. So, for example, like cattle farming.
Right, methane.
That's and it's funny. That there are people, and we're not interested in getting into politics of this, and I'm not trying to make it political, but it is true that large scale cattle farming does create methane. And it's easy, you will hear some politicians that'll say, this group is saying that, global warming is because of cow farts or something like that.
Which, they're technically wrong.
Exactly. But I mean
burps too, I would add.
Oh, yeah, sure. Right. Assorted gases,
Yeah.
But yeah, so But there are indirect ways in which we do it, and then there are the direct ways, such as burning fossil fuels, which causes a great deal of carbon dioxide in the air.
Right.
And I'll just add, when you talk about that too, is that when you talk about methane, one of the big ways that we talk about it is just like we talked about, that it's like from cattle farming and things like that. But methane is excreted from anything that dies, basically. And we've got two things that are happening in our world that are causing that. One is that we've got a larger population than ever before, which means that we have more people dying. Okay, so Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, it's the decay of humans that's causing that, but it is contributing to it. But even a bigger thing is that, to your point, we talked about how the global temperatures are rising. Well, because global temperatures are rising, that causes melting at areas where there have been, like in the Arctic ice caps, for example, that have melted a lot. There are layers and layers that are millennia old of bacteria and other like small organisms from the sea that have frozen there,
Yep.
that are dead. And that when you get to that point where they start being released, then you have, I'm trying to remember the name of, it's called a clathrate gasification. Okay, that's a very fancy way of saying that we found all these corpses of very small animals, and that by releasing them, because releasing all those gases that are trapped in the ice, we accelerate that.
You have like a huge methane bubble that comes up.
Exactly.
Yep.
And in fact, we can get into this in a little bit, but there were cases where natural changes in the temperature of the world had caused those same types of things, which had caused previous mass extinctions.
Yep.
So
I do think, if I remember correctly, and I may be putting my foot in my mouth here because this is not in my notes anywhere, but if I remember correctly, something about methane that's kind of interesting is that, one, it's something like 23 times more impactful than CO2.
Right, as far as their greenhouse effect.
Right.
On the atmosphere.
But on the positive side, methane is much less stable in the atmosphere, so it tends to dissipate much faster. So you kind of got a plus and a minus there. But anyway, so greenhouse gas emissions is one piece of it. Another piece of it is deforestation, which doesn't just mean clear-cut logging and shit like that. It also means like basically any place a human has to live, they've deforested. So,
right.
We've deforested, I forget the percentage, but it's a very large percentage of the natural forest land on the earth now, and we're doing more every day because there's more people that want to live in places.
And that I mean, we tend to think of it like you're talking about. A lot of people will talk about the clearing of the rainforests in the Amazon and things like that, which is bad. I mean, it's bad on a number of levels. I mean, part of it is that we are, actually, clearing out the homes of, the biospheres that many of these animals live in. We're reducing the size of those, but we're not reducing the population. So what happens is you have more competition for, the food and environment in which it's best for them to live in. But additionally, because we're clearing out all of this foliage, we're reducing our ability to mitigate the CO2 that's in the air and have that turned back into oxygen. So it's kind of a double whammy. And while that has certainly greatly accelerated over the last, 50 years or so, the idea of how even agriculture and humans being an agricultural society, we use a lot of land in order to grow crops. And the larger that our population has gotten, the more that we're growing things, we have to clear land to do that. Trees they provide us oxygen, but they don't provide us food for the most part.
Right.
So you go and you chop down forests in order to grow corn, things like that.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So all this deforestation, I think, is where it fits into the extinction, really clearly is that you're talking about the wholesale destruction of habitats, which then has a carry-on effect to, in some cases, entire ecosystems will collapse, because you're by clearing that forest, you're removing the underlying layer that everything above it lives off of. The insects, the fungus, the fungi, the animals, all of that stuff. Now, that whole, the animals in some cases can move to other parts of the forest, which then causes the increased competition like you're talking about. But a lot of these others can't, and they'll just die out. And so now you've lost, that whole bottom layer of the ecosystem, right. And it's never coming back, Right,
and that's one of the examples that they gave in that Sixth Extinction event. Book. Was about army ants in the rainforest in South America, and that they've essentially disappeared. And there were other species that exclusively dined on those army ants. So when your food goes away, well, in many cases you can find something to substitute. But also, what happened was the populations of those animals that were dependent on those specific types of ants also dwindled.
Right.
And then the animals that depended on those. So let's just say that's a bird that, and I don't remember the exact which animals were dependent on the army ants. But, if it's a particular type of bird, well, now that bird was not, an apex predator. It had other, animals that preyed on it.
Right.
And et cetera. So it has a chain reaction up the chain until you've got, megafauna that is also, dying out because of something like an ant not being there anymore.
Right. And the carry-on effect is quite large to the point. Like I saw a chart on the Wikipedia page that is kind of mind-blowing. But it showed basically the impact of humans as they were introduced to different areas of the world. And this is all pre-industrial. I mean, this is thousands upon thousands of years ago, but you can see usually within 1,000 years of human beings being introduced to the area, a huge drop off in the number in the biodiversity level of the area, and that was pre-industrial age. That's just from human beings going out and doing some of these things we're talking about, like deforestation.
Right. In fact, I saw something similar that I think what you're talking about in North America from the time that your basic Homo sapiens were introduced there. And then we're like you said, we're talking about like 100,000 years ago that humans, as we know them today, were first existing in these environments. And of course this is estimates. There was nobody there 100,000 years ago.
No, but I mean it's based on the fossil record, which is pretty clear.
Absolutely. But the amount of megafauna species that existed declined by like 70% within a short period of time. More recently in Madagascar, which was only about 1,000 years ago when humans were introduced there, it was about an 80% decrease very soon afterwards. Now, something I thought was interesting was Africa was a little bit different. Africa had a smaller decline. It was still like 25-30% decline in megafauna. And just by the way, megafauna just means big animals. Okay, so I'm using that term, but I laughed when I had to look it up because I was like, this sounds like a very technical term. And I'm like, no, it's just big animals. But it was only about a 25 or 30% decline in Africa. And there wasn't a great explanation about that. But I
think there's a couple of things and I'll kind of, part of this is going to be based on a fiction book, but it's a fiction book by an author who actually lived in the area as a child. Mm-hmm. Name of the author is Barbara Kingsolver, and the book is The Poisonwood Bible. But it tells the story of a missionary family living in the Congo, and she describes how basically the Congo absorbs what people do to it. Like it has like there's so many different living things in it that it's just almost impossible to beat nature back. Like it's just such a place of fertility and we're Americans. At least when I normally think of Africa, I think of starving children in Ethiopia or something. I don't really think of jungles and but that is large swaths of Africa. The Africa isn't just the Sahara. It's also a very fertile area in some parts of it. So I think that's a lot of it is that that and Africa has been one of the few places in the world which, for whatever reason, has never been, really overtaken by colonial interests. Like, I mean, this is way off topic, but the Dutch and a few other people did colonize places in Africa, but it wasn't like Africa never really had a continent spanning kind of.
They were never greatly influenced by the colonialization, I think is probably what you're saying.
But I mean, even endemically, they never had like Egypt never took over all of Africa, right? There was never any any huge force that could take over that whole continent. For whatever reason, Africa is just too wild for people to conquer, it looks like, you know?
Well, and something I thought was interesting too, just talking about Africa and how there wasn't as much of a decline. One of the things that was positive, but maybe, this may be speculation. I mean, it certainly sounds like it. But that many of the people, that there is this, there's this, I'm looking for the word, hypothesis that Homo sapiens, as we are, originated from the middle of Africa, right? And then
the out of Africa theory, yeah.
Right, exactly, and then migrated to the Middle East and et cetera. But that because we kind of originated there, alongside many of the animals and species that have existed longer than Homo sapiens have, that we kind of grew up together, if you will. That rather than, for a longer period of time, humans were trying to work more in coherence with the environment rather than trying to dominate the environment, which is what we try to do essentially everywhere else.
Well, see, I kind of disagree with that. I think humans have always tried to dominate the environment. I think if you look back at, and this is a very politically fraught subject because there's a lot of these traditionally indigenous peoples like the Maori and the American Indians or Native Americans that like to think of themselves as good shepherds of their land and all that kind of stuff. But if you look at the newer studies on this, what you often find is that that's not the case at all. They were in their own way just as damaged. I mean, the Maori is a very, very clear case. I mean, they killed the moa. They killed within 100 years or something of them being there. The moa was extinct. It's very clear that they were just as damaging to their environment as the Europeans were, for example. It's just that for whatever reason, they never kind of quote unquote graduated into the city lifestyle kind of civilization, right, where everybody's concentrated in one big area and building empires and stuff like that. They stayed in more of a it was a different state. It for whatever reason they did not exploit their environment to the same level. Not because they necessarily didn't want to, they just didn't.
Well, in many cases in Africa, I mean, I think we even see today that there are entire societies that are still very primitive from our standards, And, while the Industrial Revolution and then even beyond that with the computer ages and things like that, we have certainly gained a lot in our first world countries from those things. It could be argued that those are the same things that have caused much of the damage to the environment, right, as it is. And it could be that the fact of many areas within Africa being, I'm putting air quotes here, less civilized. And I just mean it more as in they haven't developed those same capabilities necessarily in a lot of areas. Now, granted, I mean, you got big cities where certainly they have, but there's a lot, as you say, of, untamed land.
Right.
There's a lot in it. And, maybe it's the consequence of that area being tougher to conquer and it being a generally poorer area than many places in the Western world may actually be why it's also more healthy when it comes to terms of biodiversity.
Well, yeah, I think the point you were making earlier that I never got around to responding to, that humans grew up with the creatures in Africa. I think that's a really good point because human beings to most of these other areas are an invasive species. Yeah. Like that's why the Maori killed all the moa. The moa were 12-foot tall fucking birds. Now, birds are dinosaurs with feathers. Yep. So, they're not nice fucking creatures. But what happened is they had never seen people before. They didn't know they should be scared of them. They didn't know they should be afraid of them. And this was the same thing that happened when white people came to America, with the buffalo, because the buffalo, they were afraid of the Native Americans. They knew the Native Americans would hunt them and kill them, so they were shy. But they had never seen white people. They'd never smelled the way white people smelled. So white people just literally would sit up on a hill and just shoot them all day long. They shot them from trains where they couldn't even get out and go get them. They would just pass by and kill them for the damn sheer fun of it, Yeah. So human beings are this invasive species to most of the world, but not to Africa. Africa, all those animals there, they grew up, like you said, they grew up with us. So they kind of know something to fear. Now, that's not to say that we're not still killing the ever-loving shit out of everything in Africa. I mean, the lions and elephants and like one of those Wikipedia things that just blew my mind was there was something like 12 million Africanized elephants back in, like, not that long ago, like in historical times, and now there's like they're in the thousands.
Well, so you bring up a great point, because we talk about extinctions and we talk about how we're inadvertently killing them, right? We talk about things like the climate change and the acidification of the oceans and things like that that are causing, or deforestation, that are causing changes to their environment. But also, we're just fucking killing them. Like, it's not just inadvertently. We are hunting some of these animals to extinction, whether it be for sport, as it is, like, for example, with the elephants, like we were talking about, they were hunted almost to extinction just for the ivory in their tusks. Yep. You've got people that want to go and hunt, apex predators for the thrill of it.
Yep.
But even on the other side, if it's not, maybe not malicious in that, you've got hunting for food, but places, like the bison you were talking about, that were over-hunted, over hunted to the point of almost being gone. I mean, you don't see buffalo in the United States the way that you did back in the 1800s because of just the decimation of them by hunters.
Right.
And beyond that, there's also, we were talking about agriculture. Well, you have, things that we do with pesticides. We're purposely killing certain species of plants in order to,
don't forget insects as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So, in many ways, we are, we're not just inadvertently killing them. We're literally murdering them.
which segues right into the next two things on my list, which were overhunting and overfishing. Yeah. Those two things we've been doing, ever since, humanity came about. And this is back to the point of, people having this idea that the indigenous tribes didn't do this kind of stuff. And it's not that. It's just they just frankly weren't as good at it. They didn't have the tools. Like when you have a firearm, your ability to inflict that kind of damage is significantly increased. When you have poisons that you can spray on a field, your ability to kill mass swaths of insects is much increased over your ability to pinch them off of your crops, when you don't have those things,
Absolutely. I mean, and being able to spread them from an airplane or something like that, even more so. And then on top of that, when you talk about the Native Americans, you're also talking about a much smaller population. So, I don't know the number. I don't know how many Native Americans were here in what we would consider the United States today, but it certainly wasn't 380 million like we have today. Right. And they certainly didn't have, AR rifles that they're taking out there to kill deer. Like it just, in many cases it was, archery hunting and things like that. So, we definitely have the numbers, and we have the wherewithal, and we have the desire to dominate our environment like we talked about. And, at the same time, we're also reducing the amount of area in which all of these animals live as our city sprawls continue. It's just becoming, fewer animals and fewer places for those animals to prosper.
Yeah, and I mean, when we're talking about large, megafauna like you were talking about, there was a statistic I saw that really kind of it's one of the few that really shocked me when I was looking through all this. And the statistic was basically this. Out of all of the large all the large mammals in the world, like 4% of them are wild. The rest are all humans or livestock.
Wow.
So when you think about that, like, that's kind of insane. Like, no wonder you've never seen a wolf, or you've probably never seen a bear, or, you might have never seen even a deer, depending on where you live. Right. It's absolutely ridiculous how much we've reduced these animals, and also how I didn't realize that we had that many cattle. You know what I'm saying? Like
yeah.
And if you think about this, like when you think of, many years ago when I was doing research to try to make a role playing game system, I came across this idea of biomass calculations. Basically, if you have an apex predator, and I was trying to look at like a dragon, how many dragons can be in a particular right?
Yeah, right.
If you're trying to think about, okay, I'm going to send my players up against a dragon. Well, how many damn dragons are there? You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
Dragons are big animals. They need lots to eat, right? And they're going to have a certain area that they can patrol, right? So you have to do a biomass calculation. You have to figure out what is the amount of biomass that can support this one apex predator, right? You look at it for something like a lion, it's really clear that you can only have one of those in a certain area, right? Because otherwise you're going to have big problems. Like, it's...
Well, one pack. I mean, lions are a pride.
But you can't have... If you overpopulate the area, you're going to have some big problems, right?
Right.
Humans have figured out... We're apex predators. We've figured out how to overcome that limitation because we've learned how to essentially harvest our food.
Right.
So we have removed ourselves from that natural limitation, and in the process, we have essentially pushed everything else on Earth out, and made large parts of the Earth more or less uninhabitable for anything but us.
Well, us or anything that serves us. I mean,
Right.
it's basically...
Or anything that's parasitic to us too.
Well, but it's an effort of control, right? It's like the more things that you can control, the larger your span of influence, the more, or maybe I should say, the less risk there is, right? So when you think of, in the 1700s where you have to go out in the woods and you have to hunt for your food, you don't know whether you're going to find, you don't know what you're going to find that day. When you go fishing, you don't know if they're going to bite. Like, there's a lot of risk in that. And there are times when you'd have good days, and there are times you'd have bad days, but it wasn't dependable.
Right.
Now we've turned it into something that is essentially a factory. Even though it may be in a field, it's a factory. It's dependable.
Yep.
You know your head count. You know the amount of meat you're going to get off of all of those cows, and how many eggs are going to be laid, because you're doing it in such mass quantities that even if one or two chickens are not laying that day, well, you got 50,000 that are here in a house. You know about what you're going to get, know. So it's an effort to exert control and dominance over our environment, right?
Yep.
So we've talked a lot about that, but when it comes back to mass extinctions, right? So a lot of people would say, okay, yeah, we've got species that are going extinct, and that's always happened. So, why do we think that we are either in or going into what we would consider a mass extinction that would be on the same level as the large extinctions that have happened in the past, such as in the Triassic period with the dinosaurs and the asteroid, or before that? I mean, there were 5, and we can go into that if you want to. But what makes this, like, when we look at this, what is it that makes us think that we're entering a period of a mass extinction now?
Well, I think the big thing is that the current rate, and this is estimated because you can't, like, frankly, we don't even know what all species exist. Like, I saw this. I don't remember if it was a documentary or it was something I read in a book, but it was about a biologist who was talking about, he's been to the Amazon X number of times, and every time he goes to the Amazon, he finds some handful number of brand new species that nobody's ever found before.
I mean, I've seen documentaries several times where people will go visit somewhere that's really never been examined before, and it's, hey, I found this new kind of lizard and this new kind of bird, and
and these are typically
insects.
These are typically biologists that are focused on one particular type of creature. So herpetologist or whatever, they're only looking for certain things. So they would have no idea. A herpetologist goes in there, they're going to have no idea that I also saw 47 new species of tree. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
They can't. They can only find what they find. So. And this isn't even counting the ocean, which is by and large much more diverse than anything on the land.
Well, and also much more unexplored than anything else that we have on land. So
the thing you have to keep in mind when talking about this is this is all estimates, and it's all based on what we think the total number of species are, and what we can, we're basically looking at, okay, we know of these many species and we know of these many that have gone extinct, right? So we're kind of extrapolating from that what we think is actually occurring. But based on the background extinction rate, the number I saw was between 10 and 100 times as high as the highest highest extinction rate we saw in any of the previous extinction events, and between 100 and 1,000 times the current background level. So, I mean, that's kind of insane. Like
it is.
It's not only are we talking about, this is just as bad as the previous extinctions. No, this is way worse than the previous extinctions.
And I read the same thing, and that you're right. I mean, that's scary. I mean, honestly. But that was a couple of different studies. There were some other studies that said that that we had yet to reach the level of the previous 5 mass extinctions, and that that perhaps trying to maximize what's currently happening is actually minimizing the extinctions that have happened in the past. And some of those, I mean, just for example, when in the most recent mass extinction event, where everybody knows about the dinosaurs going extinct. That's probably the most common one, right? 50% of all genuses and 75% of all species on Earth became extinct during that time. I mean, you think about that. I mean, when you think about and I can't do it all, but you've got the kingdom, phylum, blah, 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 blah.
Yep.
And then you've got family, genus, species.
Right.
I think I missed a couple in there. But, half of all of the genuses and 75% of all the species that existed on Earth were gone.
Right.
I mean, so, when you think about that and you say, okay, well, maybe we're not there yet. Or, a lot of times when we talk about the species that are gone, I saw something one day that kind of made me laugh, but, it's human, right? It's like there was a particular species of mosquito that didn't exist anymore. And anybody that read that would be like, thank God,
Yep.
But when we talk about
There's birds that rely on that mosquito.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, what kind of real impact does that have? There was a lot of talk a few years ago about how few bees there were anymore.
Yep.
That there was a great dwindling of the number of bees, and there was a lot of save the bees kind of stuff. And I knew people that were allergic to bee stings. They would be like, get rid of the bees. I don't want the bees. But it was like, okay, but then you don't have honey. If you don't have honey,
Well, you don't have pollinators. You might not have.
well, yeah, absolutely, yeah, that's bad too. So that's worse, probably.
Yeah. So interesting. I'm going to kind of jump in here because I just read another book. What was the name of that book? Hang on. The other book was The Uninhabitable Earth, which I do not recommend anybody read.
Wait, is that because it was a bad book or because you were depressed after reading it?
Because it is the most depressing. I couldn't finish it. I stopped an hour from the end of it. Like I read it on Audible. It's like 24 hours long or something, and I stopped an hour from the end because it doesn't get better. It just gets worse. It's not as I'll say it's not as scientifically grounded as the other books I've read on this, but it's more of a big long form essay. But he's not far off. Like I read enough of the scientific commentary to it to know he's not too far off. But one of the things he talks about is how that whole bee thing is more or less a hoax, because basically the bee industry is an industry, and so they're using this hype to basically so they can tractor trailer their bees all over the country to pollinate stuff.
Okay.
So it's anyway, but and he was upset about it because it's basically taking money away from legitimate environmental causes that are legitimate problems.
Interesting.
But anyway, back to your point, we're talking about loss of species. It's not just that the species are going extinct. That isn't the whole story. Like just a loss of the numbers of, animals or insects or whatever, that causes a loss of biodiversity because the species might not be extinct. Like if you chop down half of a rainforest, maybe you didn't drive any species extinct. Maybe they all still survive, but there's half of the ones that they used to be because they're in a smaller area now, right? Which necessarily reduces the biodiversity. So, one of the numbers of the study I saw said, basically, it says the Earth is experiencing exceptionally rapid loss of biodiversity. 75% of terrestrial and 66% of marine environments are severely altered by human actions. So, it's like, when you start talking about numbers like that, where 3/4 and 2/3 of the only environments we have on Earth are severely impacted, right. It's even if we're not experiencing it now, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. We're rapidly building a planet to where the only things that are going to exist are us and, like you said, the creatures that serve us, and then, like I said, the creatures that are parasitic to us, like rats and roaches and mosquitoes and stuff like that. And if you think about that very long, what you come to the conclusion is that evolution doesn't stop. Like it's not like there's not going to be new things that appear, but the new things that appear in the time scales we're talking about are things like viruses and bacteria. And what is the largest feeding source they're going to have? What is the largest environment that they can thrive in? And it's going to be us and the things that we that serve us. So even if you say that, this whole global warming thing is not going to cause, we're not going to have problems, which is, I think is totally horseshit. Even if you say that, right, and you think, well, we're just going to build this city or citywide, this Earth city, where it's just going to be one big metropolis, the whole,
Coruscant.
Yeah, it's going to be Coruscant, right? And that's going to be great because everything will be air conditioned. Even if you think that's true, then you now have to think about the fact that, well, you're not going to stop bacteria from evolving to try and, find a new place to live, a new environment to thrive in.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting too, because a lot of times we will look at anything that we see as a negative to the human race, and it's like we want to wipe it out. How many times have you seen things that are antibacterial this, antibacterial that? But then when you have to realize, and I know this is probably a subject for another day, but the amount of beneficial bacteria that is in every single one of our bodies and how we wouldn't be able to live without them, you can't just go and say, let's just get rid of the bacteria,
right.
And the sheer vast number of species of bacteria that live in your body and all the various things they do that are beneficial to your body to be able to weed out and say, okay, now there's this new invasive bacteria to us, like it's almost impossible to do that.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying that we won't get the technology to be able to get there, but we're not there today. That's not something that we can do today at all. So,
Right.
I mean, it's scary.
Yeah, kind of a side comment on that, is one of those things that's kind of mind-blowing to know is that genetically, there are more things that live inside you by sheer number that do not share your DNA than there are that do. There are more cells in your body that do not have your DNA than there are cells in your body that do have your DNA.
That's crazy.
But anyway.
So okay. So if we get to a point where we say, yes, we are entering a danger zone. Now, some will argue we're already there. Some will argue we're entering it or that we're close. But we're in a place where we are on the cusp of a mass extinction event. Really, there's two questions that come out of it, I think, that I think of. One is, what do we do about it? How do we fix it? But the other is, are humans one of the species that goes extinct? You know?
So this is where I kind of differ with the uninhabitable Earth guy. And this is going to sound very crass, but I think this is a self-solving problem. We're the problem, and we're going to solve ourselves. Like, I don't think we're going to go extinct, honestly. What I think is going to happen, and I've done a lot of thinking about this because it is kind of a huge part of a new book I'm working on. But what I think is going to happen is I think global warming, a combination of global warming or climate change, if you prefer that term, deglobalization, demographic collapse, and war and famine caused by all these things is going to cause a drastic reduction of human population. It's going to force those that survive further north and south, respectively, further away from the equator, essentially. And humanity in about 200 years, or society, I should say, not humanity. I mean, we're not going to change genetically that much in 200 years. But society, I think, in 200 years is going to be essentially unrecognizable from what we know it as right now. I think our grandchildren's grandchildren would look back on today and have absolutely no conception of how we lived. It'll be fantastic. It'll be like a fairy tale to them that there were people, swimming, in Los Angeles. I think that's insane. Because if you think about it, if you return Los Angeles just to its natural state, it's just dry scrubland and hills, man. Like that's not a place you'd want to live.
You were talking about fiction earlier, but how it can kind of give us a glimpse into what things might be. There was a book that I read recently called The Deluge. I think I mentioned it to you one other time, where it's really about climate change and in kind of a near future. It's a very political book. It's very scientific. It goes into a lot of details of some what ifs of things, but it's also fiction. I really recommend it. In fact, Stephen King even had recommended it as being one of the scariest books that he had ever read, but not because it's horror, but because it's really realistic.
Right.
But one of the things that happens in that book, and I don't want to give away too much in it, but that, because of the droughts and wildfires that occur in California, Los Angeles literally catches on fire, which is one of the things. And it's very realistic and that sort of thing. There's a lot else that goes on in that book. There's flooding. There's biodiversity issues. A lot of the things that we're talking about. I'd really recommend it. It's not a fun read. It's just as much as some of the other stuff we're talking about. It's kind of a depressing book, but it is a really kind of scary picture of what the world that we live in and where we could be moving into just in the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, I'll check it out. Yeah, I mean, I really think people have this idea that the world can only change so fast. And I like I said, man, I've been skeptical for a long time, But the last decade has kind of completely turned me around. Like I am really concerned for what for just my son, for when he is my age, when he's 20 years from now, when he looks at the world, what it's going to look like. As much as it's changed in the last 10, I can't, it's hard to fathom how bad it's going to be in 20.
I saw a thing, we're talking about the future, right? And comparing to some of the numbers that we've given about previous mass extinction events. There was a study that said, and keep in mind that we're at roughly 1 degree Celsius above the baseline already, okay? And that's been, rising faster as time has gone on. It's accelerating. And, there's a lot of, like the Paris Climate Accords and things like that, they have goals where it's like they want to, stop this before it reaches 2 degrees. Yeah, exactly. Because of the catastrophic impacts that can come from just small but global average changes in the temperatures. So this one study that was published in 2022 by Science Advances said that if global warming reaches 2.7 degrees Celsius, or about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, by 2100, then we will have lost about 13% of all the terrestrial vertebrate species on Earth. And if it went as far as 8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 4.4 degrees Celsius, then it would be as much as 27% of all vertebrate species would be gone. So, there's many reasons for that, but that in both cases, roughly 2/3 of those would be due to the climate change itself. Right. So, I mean, those are kind of scary numbers. I mean, and we're not talking about insects in that part. We're talking about mammals. We're talking about, megafauna in most cases,
Which we're already low on. It gets, the more you read about this, the scarier it gets. And this is one of the reasons, like I said, that Uninhabitable Earth book, I don't recommend anybody. It'll really just depress the shit out of you. When you start thinking about things like ocean acidification and how, there's a feedback loop here. Increasing the temperature doesn't just increase the temperature.
Right.
It causes a lot of other things to occur. Like people think about the melting of the ice sheets, right? And they think, well, so what? So the water will rise 3 inches. Who gives a shit, right? No, it's not just that, man. First of all, the melting of the ice sheets, people think, well, we'll just, we'll cool it back down and it'll go back. You don't understand how hard that is. I mean, the best example I heard about this is take an ice tray out of your kitchen, out of your freezer, dump it out on the floor, let it melt, and then try to get it back into the ice tray.
Right.
Right. That's what you're talking about.
Right.
So, and beyond that, like I said, it's not just the fact that it's melting. It's not just the fact that the oceans increase. You're talking about, an increase in the acidification of the ocean. You're talking about a lowering of the albedo effect on the polar ice caps.
Right.
All of these things add up, and they create these feedback loops, which make it worse. Now, all of that said, if there is one shining lining, in that whole book, it is this: even in the worst case scenario, it's only going to get so hot. Like something like, I think he said something like 8 degrees Celsius was probably outside of the realm of possibility. Like somewhere between 6 and 8 is probably about how hot it's ever going to get.
Well, so let me ask you a question about that. And that may be true, but I'm curious. I have seen it quoted at times. There's this term, a runaway greenhouse effect.
Right.
And
where we become Venus, basically.
Exactly, because that's what you see on Venus, is that you've basically got a world that, by all accounts, from what we believe, used to be much more Earth-like. But because of the amount of carbon dioxide and methane that is in the air...
Stupid Venetians, man.
They've ruined their planet.
It was all women, too, because, women are from Venus, so...
Oh, right. Well, Mars is not much more habitable. So.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. But yeah, so you've got a planet that was hotter than Earth, obviously, because it was closer to the sun, but was much more Earth-like. But then because of these greenhouse gases, it's like the more that gets um, deployed, if you will, into the environment, the more that they have an effect on the sun's rays on raising the heat of the environment. And the more that the sun's rays have an effect on the heat of the environment, the more greenhouse gases come into play. So it's that runaway effect that you're talking about, where the more that it occurs, the more it's going to occur. It becomes exponential. And that's why you've got a planet like Venus, which, although it's a great deal further away from the sun than Mercury, is actually hotter than Mercury is because of the greenhouse gases there. So you'll hear that reference sometimes when people talk about climate change on Earth. And now that's a very, very extreme example. But what is it about our environment that keeps us from being able to experience a runaway greenhouse?
So I don't
like
remember
that?
all of the examples, and I didn't write it down, or all the reasons I didn't write it down of why he said this. But it basically came down to there are other effects that occur once you get to a certain temperature that offset that. So one of them I know for sure is that deforestation actually increases albedo. So forests are dark and they absorb sunlight. So they're hot, right? And so when you convert them to plains, the albedo actually increases and it reflects more back into space. We didn't explain what the albedo effect is, but basically that's where the sun's rays come down, they hit something reflective like ice, or think about if we took mirrors and mirrored the entire Sahara Desert, it would reflect an enormous amount of light back into space and blind the shit out of any aliens trying to visit our planet. So that should be what we do whenever we're being conquered.
Or you can just focus them all into a single point and
Oh
have
yeah,
a death
burn
ray.
burn them like an ant. Yeah. But anyway, so there's lots of little effects like that also occur. That it's basically like, and this kind, I don't know, this is one of these things that kind of feels right because that's the way complex systems tend to work. There's so many things going on in symbiosis that it's not so simple as to say you increase this thing and this thing happens. It's you increase this thing and a whole bunch of shit happens, and some of those things mitigate the effects of what you did.
Yeah, the only, and I'm not disagreeing with that author or you in particular, but when you talk about it feeling right, if you look at a graph of our average global temperatures over the last 30 years, you can see that the average increase is accelerating. This is not something that's going up at a moderate.
No. I'm not
pace,
arguing with that. What I'm saying though in that is what I said earlier. That's a self-solving problem, right? That's only going to happen for so long. Like,
well, and that's true. But it's interesting when you think about humans' environment in which for us to survive. We've got certain needs, and you've got temperature, you've got food, you've got shelter, you've got clean water. Those are really the main things that we need to survive. Well, oxygen, I should say. Yeah, breathable air. We are really good at making those things if we don't have them, just like we've talked about.
Not water, and we're running out of water. That's one of the things I didn't get to. But water scarcity is a big part of why we're undergoing this extinction event, and it's going to get worse because we're draining the aquifers at a quite prodigious rate, and the increased heat means that not as much water collects in basins and rivers and lakes and shit. Instead, it goes up into the air, right?
Well, right, but doesn't it just? I mean, isn't it part of the water cycle, though? I mean, it does go into the air,
yes,
but then it
but
condenses
also,
and then it comes back down, right?
But you also have humidity, right? And the more water, you can get a lot higher concentrations of water in the air than what we have now. And this also leads to the other part of the self-solving problem, right? Because most people don't realize this. Once you get to a certain level of a certain wet bulb temperature, a certain level of heat combined with a certain level of humidity, it's impossible for a human being to cool off. So at a certain point, say it's, I don't remember what it is exactly, but say it's 108 degrees outside at 95% relative humidity. At that point, sweat doesn't cool you off anymore.
Right, because it doesn't evaporate.
Right. And so at that point, you're just going to die. Like, there's no way. You have to be inside in someplace air conditioned, or you're just going to fucking die.
Right.
And that's just how it is. And unfortunately, what's going to happen is most of India is going to die because India is right in the worst spot for this to happen. They also have the most people, right? And they have, a largely underdeveloped society where not everybody has AC, right?
I guess it's fair to say the infrastructure is having a hard time at times keeping up with the population.
Right. Yeah. And that's going to happen to really a lot of the most populated sections of the world, including large swaths of the United States, eventually.
Well, and speaking of that, I mean, obviously we're talking about heat. We're talking about, lack of water. But there's also, when we talk about shelter, it's not just having something over your head, it's also not being underwater, right? And when you look at most of our largest cities, when we talk about, rising sea levels, we've got a lot of very large cities that would frankly be underwater, would be constantly flooded.
Honest to God, I don't know how it's not. I think selling real estate in Miami is the biggest fucking scam in the world right now.
Yeah, but not just Miami. I mean, Miami is an awful one. You're absolutely right.
Miami, they already have to dump sand on the beach to keep the fucking beach.
Well, and it's again just going back to that book I was talking about. But that's one of the things I talk a lot about is flooding in Miami and the deluge as well. But it's New York City too, and it's L.A. and San Francisco, and it's Tokyo, and a lot of. Like Amsterdam, and a lot of
Amsterdam's already having problems with it too.
Right. I mean, we as humans, we want to build on the coasts because of convenience.
Also because it's a port. Like, and ports, at least up until the modern age, ports were, and they still are in modern age, hugely important. In fact, New York City is such a valuable port that probably if it goes away, we will not have the same ability to ship that we do now.
And just the fact that, ports are so important, and they are, I mean, specifically for international shipping, of large quantities of goods, I mean, you think about the globalization of the economy and, what percentage of the goods that are bought in the United States actually are manufactured outside the United States and have to be shipped over the water?
Or even if they are manufactured here, they're probably just assembled here,
right? Yeah,
out of parts built every fucking way.
Exactly. So, and when you think about the fact that rising waters would affect literally every single port in the world because they, by definition, are on the water,
right?
Then I mean that's huge.
Yep.
That's huge.
Yep. It's like I said, I don't think, and this is kind of a different episode, but I really don't think the next 200 years from now, it's going to look so different. But this is back to your question was, why is this stuff not going to go above a certain level? It's because simply there's not going to be enough humanity left to keep it being bad, is a large part of it. Like, we're just not going to solve that problem. We're going to be whittled back down to size. And then nature will do what nature does, the species, some species will adapt, some won't. 2 million years from now, you'll never, the fossil record will be the only way it happened. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, something I think is really interesting, and we'll probably talk about this in another episode as well, but there's the Drake equation where we were talking about, where we talk about the prevalence of other life outside of our world, right? One of the calculations that's done, or one of the estimates that's part of that Drake equation, is the length of time that a society is in a state where it can communicate with other worlds outside of its own. And what you're describing right now, what the pessimistic estimate for that was only about 230 years or something like that, right, if I remember right. That seems pessimistic, but the idea is that we're our own worst enemy. And that the pessimistic view of that is that we eventually collapse under our own weight, whether it be through war, whether it be through self-sabotage, whether it's just that we destroy the environment that we live in. We have to, reorganize, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a solely human issue. Like, people like to pick on humanity about this, including me. About we're just so selfish and self-serving. That we we don't look at the fact that we're soiling our own nest, and we don't look at the fact that we're destroying ourselves in the process of material gain or whatever. But this same shit happens in an ant farm, man. Like, it happens in any situation where you take a life form, from bacteria on up, where you take a life form and you put them in a situation where there is abundance for them to grow out of control, right? They will eventually overrun their environment and kill themselves. All of them do it. It's the most natural thing in the world. It's a self-solving problem.
So something that we've seen in our environments even today, when you look at first world environments, you look at the U.S., you look at Western Europe, you look at Japan, other places like that, reproduction has gone way down. You see that families are not having as many children as they once did. But when you look at third world countries, due to a number of reasons that we don't need to get into, I don't think, here, but due to a number of reasons, you will see that the number of children that those families have tend to be much higher.
Mm-hmm.
As a whole, our population is going up. We are still today seeing a rise in global population. But we're starting to see more, because of those trends, you're going to see more population in more of those third world countries, and potentially even, seeing a lessening of population in the industrialized world.
Oh, you're definitely this is definitely fodder for another episode, because this is something I've done a good bit of research on. But what you're talking about, at least in first world, is demographic collapse, because what's happened is people have in these countries, we've moved into cities, into urban centers, and what happens when you do that is when you're out in a rural environment, children are useful. They're free labor, right? So
Right.
So they don't really cost you money so much as they provide you with labor. They provide you with income.
Right.
So you want to have them. But when you move to the city, now you got to have a room for this little shit, and you got to send them to school, right? And you got to pay for their insurance, right? And they're friggin' expensive, right? So you tend to have a lot less. And you see this in every single society that has converted to an urbanized environment. And the problem is horrible for some nations. Like, the United States is way better than most because we have so much space. China has a horrible problem with this, and Germany may even be worse than China, because in both those cases, when you have a society to where you have two people making less on average than two babies, right? What you have is the generations shrink. It's like a reverse pyramid. The generations shrink. The farther down the line you go, the smaller and smaller and smaller each generation gets. And you get to a point, which we're getting to right now, to where the life expectancy of the older generations is so long that now you're not even producing enough babies. You might have great grandparents still alive, right? Well, you don't have enough babies down there to support even the services you need to keep those people alive in the future. This is just going to get worse, and it's going to get worse for every single industrialized nation in the world. So yes, what you're going to see is a rise of third world nations, or more likely an influx of refugees from third world nations, essentially taking over first world nations. This is and this is a little political. I don't want to get too far into this, but this is kind of the fear with Germany right now, because they're indigenous, and France too, to be honest. Their indigenous population, we call them indigenous. I mean, they're Europeans, but their indigenous population is getting smaller and smaller and older. They're aging out, while the refugees that they're accepting that are coming in, largely Muslim, largely from the Middle East, right, are getting bigger and bigger. And at some point, there's already tension there, especially in France, where they have this very strong French identity, and there's a very strong feeling of what it is to be French, and they this is very politically incorrect to say, but they really don't accept these Muslim refugees as French people, as French citizens, in the way they accept white people as French citizens.
Well, and we've seen that over and over again. I mean, you've seen so many, countries that will just split over the fact that they have different belief systems, different, different religions, different, identities, cultures. And, you look at, when I was in high school, it was very, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia were two countries, and now they're like eight. Between the two of them, right? And it's all because of that. It's because of the split.
As far as we were concerned, we're Americans. As far as we were concerned, they were the same anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, and I really would like to get into that at some point. But yeah, I do think we're straying from our topic here. But so I guess the question would be, we've painted a really dire picture of, what the world may look like, what this sixth extinction event really means for us. So where's the hope? What?
It's a self-solving problem, man.
Well, but when you say that, I'm just going to dig into that a little bit, because what you're saying is that it's a decline in population that's going to cause.
Well, just think about it. Like if the world population was even 1/10 of what it is today, nothing we're talking about would be a problem.
No, I understand that, but that's not making it less dire. I guess that's the point.
No, you're right.
So
I guess the hope for me there is what I'm saying that's hopeful is that it's not going to be the end of the human race, like nuclear war would be, right? Okay, or a rabid bioterror weapon. There are things that literally
zombie
would be
apocalypse, right?
Oh goodness, there are things that literally would be the end of the human race, right? That are literally existential crises.
Right.
I don't think this is one of them. I think this is a crisis for sure, but it's a self-solving problem.
So I guess one thing is that we have really linked in this conversation climate change and an extinction event, and those things are linked, but specifically,
I think what we more tried to do was link human activity and an extinction event, because climate change was only one of the variables we brought up.
But that's true. That's true. You're absolutely right. But I think that it's the climate change that is the concern about when you're talking about how the world may very well change over the next 100 to 200 years. It's less about the extinction event and more about the climate change.
Sure.
Is that true?
Yep.
Okay. So, short of, decimating our population, you hear a lot today, and again, I don't want to take this down as extreme political path. That's not our goal here. But I think that a lot of reasonable people agree that this is a crisis, just like you said, and that something should be done, and that something should be done now, or even before now, to help prevent, whether it be climate change, to the extent that it's happening, or the mass extinction of many species of our planet. What are the things when you're choosing your leaders? That's really what it comes down to, right? You're looking at the people who are making the laws for your nation. What do you look for? What are the things that are important? What are the things that we should be doing?
I'm going to have to be the devil's advocate here. I honestly don't think it matters. I'm just going to throw this out here. 90% of the, well, not 90%. I'm making that number up. A majority.
Like 86% of all statistics are made up.
A majority, though, I know this for sure. A majority of the CO2 entering the atmosphere right now is coming from third world countries.
That's true. I just saw that recently, where I saw that they were talking about pollutants from specific cities. Like there was no U.S. city that was in the top 100 or something.
Yeah, there was
like
something
that.
like, there was another statistic I saw that said something. I don't know. Most people don't know this, but one of the biggest CO2 emitters is concrete. Creating concrete is high in CO2 emissions. And China, there was some statistic, it was just insane, that like China in the last year did more, poured more concrete than U.S. has in its entire history, or something like that.
Yeah, but the top polluting city in terms of CO2 wasn't even in China. It was Bahrain.
Yeah. So what I'm saying here is you're not going to convince a third world country to not burn CO2 to try to elevate themselves into the first world. You're just not. That's never going to happen. So honestly, I don't think it makes a quarter of a shit who you elect. Like what I think is going to happen, and this is as cynical as it can be, but I understand human nature well enough. I don't see any other way this is gonna occur. Lots of people are gonna have to die. Like people have to understand this is a real fucking problem, and they're not. It's just like if you go out on a road and you're driving down this old back road and there's a bad fucking curve on it, man, and you slam on brakes and you go through that curve and you go, holy shit, why wasn't there a sign there? Because nobody's died on the fucking curve yet. As soon as somebody dies on the curve, there'll be a sign that goes up. Right? Yeah. That's just us, man. That's human nature. So I'm sorry I can't be hopeful. I don't have it in me. I don't think there's any hope of stopping this short of at least some massive loss of humanity. And unfortunately, I think that loss is going to come, in some of the more desperate places in the world. I honestly don't think the U.S. is going to feel it that strongly.
It's going to come in places where people are going to be more impacted by the change, right? I mean, in places where
Australia is one place I think we should look to as that might hit. This is very cynical of me, but I'm just going to say it. Most Americans, if they hear 200 million people died in India, are going to be like, whatever. I'll get less people calling me. Asking for, for me to switch my credit card company or something, whatever, who cares, right? When you tell them 200 million people died in Australia, it's a completely different reaction. Okay. Yeah. It's just, that's our society. I think that's the biggest hope is that you get an event that kills enough people that people wake up and actually start taking this shit seriously. And once that happens, if countries as rich as the U.S. were willing to go to these third world countries and say, instead of burning your fossil fuel to build yourself up to the first world, here's what we'll do. We'll put in solar power plants. We'll put in nuclear power plants, which we need more of, which people aren't fucking talking about. Yeah. But we'll put in nuclear power plants. We'll set you up for success on a renewable energy source, so you no longer have to burn these fossil fuels, and we'll do it on our fucking dime. Until we're willing to do that, I don't think we're going to see any change.
Yeah, but I do think, and this is, I guess, where my hope is that, first of all, you're right. The U.S. or any one particular country can't do it by itself because you don't have any kind of authority over all of the other countries that are not necessarily playing by the rules, or you can set all the rules that you want to through the UN or whatever, but until there's any kind of bite to it. One of the things that they talked about, again, and I keep referring back to this book, The Deluge, but one of the things they talked about was carbon pricing, where when that anybody, and this was something that was going to be has been presented as something that is a global kind of idea, is that you have to pay as a company or as a nation for each ton of carbon dioxide that you produce and put into the atmosphere. Right. And that it gives you a financial incentive in order to find other things to do. That's something, but it would have to be something that's done on a global level. If we can find ways that we can both, as you suggested, find cleaner energy sources that can cover everything we need. Nuclear is a great example. People get spooked because of the scare of nuclear disasters, but frankly, coal power and oil power have killed many more people over time. Coal power
kills more people every fucking day than every nuclear disaster has ever.
Absolutely, it's just not a. It's not a big dramatic event. Right. It's because of lung cancer.
It's the same thing with airplanes, right? People are scared of airplanes because when one goes down, 200 people die, right? But every day, way more people die in a car than ever going to an airplane,
right? So if we can find ways to globalize the concern and to find ways to hold each other accountable in ways that people play by the rules. It's human nature, as you said. You hear sometimes, and I'm going to show my Southern here, but in NASCAR, they're like, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
there are a lot of countries, and I'm not excluding the U.S. from that. There are a lot of countries that are going to try to do what they can do to get the most advantage. And if they can sneak around rules and things like that, they're absolutely going to do that. But if we can find a way to all get on the same page, to understand this as being a real, legitimate concern, a crisis, something that has to be addressed or it's going to have monumental impact to every single living thing on Earth, then I feel like we have the capacity to work together across, borders and across oceans and be able to make the kind of changes. When we had in 2020 and 2021, but especially in 2020 with COVID, and we had these. I mean, COVID was awful. Okay, I'm not trying to just make it sound as if it was a wonderful thing, but when we looked back on the year 2020 and we looked at the amount of CO2 emissions in 2020, because there was so many fewer people driving, and that we actually lowered significantly the amount of CO2 emissions that were coming from the United States because there were so few people driving, because so many people were working from home and everything was shut down. I'm not saying that we got to shut everything down. Obviously, you got to have people got to live their lives. We got to figure out how to do this and do it in a way that we can continue on as a society. But, we saw a measurable difference in what we were doing because we had policies that were in place in order to make that happen. So that gives me some hope, that we can actually see something and measure it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with you. It is controllable if there's the will to do it. The problem is, I think we're all so self-centered and have such divergent goals that the only way I see us coming together to do that is, after some really tragic thing happens. It's got to be something big enough to shock everyone into waking the hell up and realizing that this is not the punchline to a shitty movie. This is reality, and it's occurring right now.
And unfortunately, I do think that you're right about that, that there's going to be some, category 6 or 7 hurricane that's going to wipe out a U.S. city, or there's going to be, some, forest fire that does hit Los Angeles or something like that, or, some other environmental event that is going to affect a large population center that we're finally going to say we need to do something about it. I think you're probably right about that, and I think that the politicalization, sorry, it's a hard word, of climate change makes it a lot more difficult. Because, and again, as much as we don't want to get into politics of left and right and everything here, the truth is that there is money to be made by fossil fuels, and there is a lot of lobbying that goes on by the fossil fuels companies in order to pass laws that help protect the amount of energy that's being generated through fossil fuels. There is trillions and trillions of dollars that are based on that, and because of that, that runs a lot. And it's not until you can get the vast majority of U.S. sentiment behind clean energy. I mean, vast majority. I'm talking about, not just a simple majority. I'm talking about you got to have like 80-90% of the U.S. that's, pushing for this.
But again, I'm saying I don't think that even matters. And I mean, I've argued this, and I've argued this in a blog post years ago where I went through this. I did the calculations to find out that, the ethanol, the 10% ethanol you put in your tank only accounts to something like 0.003% of the global warming load. Like it's basically, it's not only worthless, it's harmful because it makes you think you're doing something good when you're really fucking not. It's the U.S. provides such a small impact to this.
Right.
We could shut everything in the U.S. We could glass the U.S. We could blow up. We nuke ourselves into oblivion tomorrow, and it will make no fucking difference.
But we're
Except
not,
the albedo effect would be
but
better.
we're not as bad as we used to be.
No.
And
That's true of all of the first world pretty much.
Exactly, and that's kind of the point. Is that?
But we're not going to survive for the third world to get there. We're not going to survive without huge catastrophes for the third world to get there. Again, I think we're going to survive. Like I said, it's a self-solving problem.
Right,
But,
and I think we're saying the same thing in that I still think that there would have to be some catastrophic event that's going to get people to kind of gather around it. I think about 9/11, okay? And that, again, was terrible, and it was impactful. And I remember sitting for days watching CNN and watching, image over and over again of the World Trade Center coming down and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was awful. But I also remember how it seemed like, regardless of your political affiliation or anything like that, in the days following that, you saw so many people that were flying, American flags from their cars.
Yep.
It became a very patriotic thing, and it felt like, for a brief period of time, and 6 months or something like that, it felt like we weren't as divided as we were. And I do think that if you had something that was, and not that I'm begging for this by any means, but if there was something that was sufficiently tragic that caused us to get past the political differences and to actually see this as a problem that needed solving, then I think we could do it.
well, that's much more hopeful than I am. But I think that's as much agreement as we're going to get.
Oh, so this has been a pretty deep, kind of dark, kind of heavy subject. So,
Hopefully, we'll be onto something nicer next time.
yeah, you want to talk about video games or role-playing games or
Something like that. Something that doesn't involve everybody dying. How about that?
Yay! And everybody doesn't die in the next episode. All right.
Thank you for listening to the Effing Up the Ineffable podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. If you didn't, well, thanks for sticking around this long anyway. We are available on most major podcast platforms, including Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and more. We are currently releasing new episodes every 3 weeks on Thursdays, but hope to increase the frequency of releases in the near future. Please subscribe to us on your favorite platform to be informed when new episodes release. And also, we love feedback. Feel free to find and follow us on X, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, or Facebook and let us know what you think. You can also email us at effinguptheineffable@gmail.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.